2 years after my wife died, my daughter took me to court because she wanted to seize $1 million of my assets. He needs psychiatric help. My daughter said that in a cold voice, and her attorney burst out laughing. She claimed I had lost control, that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. But I did not get angry. I did not defend myself. Then the judge turned to her attorney and asked a question that left the entire courtroom stunned. "Is it true that you don't know who he is?" The attorney froze. My daughter's face turned pale. And that was the moment everything began to change. Welcome to the story. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. I always read them, and it means more than you think. A quick note before we begin: parts of this story include dramatized elements woven in for reflection and awareness. Any similarities to specific names or places are coincidental, but the message behind it is one that matters. I kept my hands folded on the table, fingers pressed tight against my palms. Across the courtroom, my daughter was asking a judge to declare me incompetent. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 4. A hummed overhead, casting everything in cold white. October 15th, 2024. 10:47 a.m. Outside, rain blurred the glass windows. Inside, Jessica stood at the podium in a navy blazer, hair pulled back in a neat bun. Professional, composed, confident, her voice never wavered. "Your Honor, my father is no longer capable of managing his own affairs. He's withdrawn from his family. He's lost his employment. He exhibits signs of severe depression and isolation." Judge Raymond Holland, early 60s, with sharp gray eyes, listened without expression. Jessica's attorney, Mark Sullivan, mid-40s, polished suit, tapped his tablet. A photograph appeared on the screen mounted to the wall. Me, alone in a grocery store, produce section, standing near the apples. The lighting made me look gaunt, tired, lost. Another photograph. Me sitting on a bench in Riverside Park, staring at nothing. Out of context, they looked like proof. "The Mr. Bennett has been placed on administrative leave from his position," Sullivan said. "He no longer responds to his daughter's calls. He's isolated himself completely from those who care about him." I sat 10 feet away, silent. My attorney, Ellen Crawford, sat beside me with a thin folder closed on the table. She told me not to react, so I didn't. But under the table, my jaw was clenched so tight my teeth ached. Judge Holland glanced at the petition in front of him. "Ms. Bennett, how long has your father exhibited this alleged incapacity?" "Approximately 2 years, Your Honor." Jessica's voice was calm, rehearsed. "It worsened significantly after my grandfather's death in August. And you're requesting full financial authority, protection." "Oh, yes, Your Honor. For his own protection." The words landed like stones. For his own protection. Judge Holland turned to Ellen. "Ms. Crawford, does your client wish to respond at this time?" Ellen stood. Mid-40s, dark blazer, reading glasses hanging from a chain. "Not at this time, Your Honor. But we will be responding fully within the allotted period." The judge looked at me directly. "Mr. Bennett, do you understand the nature of this petition?" "Yes, Your Honor." My voice came out steady, clear. Not the voice of a man incapable of managing his own life. I saw the flicker of surprise on Jessica's face. She'd expected confusion, silence, compliance. Judge Holland turned back to Sullivan. "Counselor, you've stated Mr. Bennett lost his employment. Can you clarify the circumstances?" Sullivan consulted his notes. "He was let go from his position as a risk analyst, Your Honor. Performance-related termination." "Ms. Bennett, is that accurate?" Jessica hesitated for half a second. "That's my understanding, yes." "Your understanding?" the judge repeated. "You're not certain?" "He didn't discuss it with me, Your Honor. But that's part of the pattern we're concerned about: withdrawal, inability to communicate about basic life matters." Judge Holland's eyes shifted to me. Mr. Bennett, I met his gaze. That characterization is inaccurate, Your Honor. I was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. That review concluded 2 weeks ago. I was cleared of all allegations and offered full reinstatement with a formal apology from my employer. The courtroom went still. Jessica's expression didn't change, but her hands gripped the edge of the podium. Sullivan shifted his weight. Your Honor, we were unaware. Clearly. Judge Holland made a note. Ms. Bennett, you've stated your father shows cognitive decline and an inability to manage finances. Do you have medical documentation supporting this claim? Not formal documentation at this time, Your Honor, but his behavior over the past 2 years. No medical evaluation has been conducted. No, Your Honor. No neurological assessment. No physician's statement. We believe the circumstances warrant immediate intervention. Your Honor, which is why, Counselor Sullivan, the judge's tone sharpened. You're requesting an emergency conservatorship. That standard requires a showing of imminent danger, imminent financial harm, imminent risk to health or safety. I'm not seeing evidence of imminent anything in this petition. Sullivan stood quickly. Your Honor, we believe the totality of circumstances, the job loss, the isolation, the refusal to communicate, but Mr. Bennett just clarified that he didn't lose his job. He was cleared and reinstated. That undermines a significant portion of your argument. Yes, Your Honor, but do you have evidence of imminent financial mismanagement? Bank records showing reckless spending, unpaid bills, eviction notices. Sullivan hesitated. Not at this time, Your Honor, but given his mental state, which has not been evaluated by a medical professional. Jessica leaned toward Sullivan, whispering something urgent. He shook his head slightly, jaw tight. Judge Holland looked at Ellen. Ms. Crawford, does your client wish to present anything at this time? Ellen stood. Your Honor, we have substantial evidence that will directly contradict the characterization of Mr. Bennett as mentally or financially incapacitated. We will be filing a comprehensive response, including documentation of his professional background, his current financial stability, and the actual circumstances surrounding this petition. She paused. We will respond fully, Your Honor. The judge nodded slowly. This hearing is continued for 2 weeks. October 29th, 9 a.m., this courtroom. In the interim, I'm ordering a temporary freeze on all joint accounts and assets shared between Mr. Bennett and the petitioner pending resolution. Mr. Bennett's personal accounts remain under his sole control. Jessica's face went pale. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck. Jessica turned immediately to Sullivan, speaking in a low, urgent voice. He was already gathering his papers, his confidence from 10 minutes ago completely gone. Ellen closed her folder without opening it. 2 weeks, she said quietly. We'll be ready. I stood slowly. Across the aisle, Jessica looked at me for the first time since the hearing began. I didn't look away. She turned and walked out, Sullivan trailing behind her. Ellen touched my arm. You did well. Stay quiet. Let her think she rattled you. She didn't. I know. But let her think it anyway. I watched through the courtroom windows as Jessica and Sullivan stood in the hallway, his hands gesturing, her arms crossed. She looked back once through the glass. I didn't move. The worst part wasn't what she'd said. It was how prepared she was. Every document, every photograph, every word. She'd been planning this for months. But so had I. I just needed her to finish first. Let me take you back. Because that wasn't the first time Jessica called me a disappointment. The first time wasn't in a courtroom. It was in a house that doesn't exist anymore. On an evening that smelled like burnt pasta and regret. It was 2016, 8 years ago. Jessica was 24. Linda had just told me she wanted a divorce. The papers sat on the kitchen table, neat and organized and final. Jessica came home that weekend, not to see me, to help her mother pack. I was in the garage when she found me. I'd been sorting through old file boxes, things I'd kept from a life she'd never known I'd had. FBI case summaries, commendations, evidence logs, all of it labeled and dated and useless now. Mom says you're done, she said. Not a question. A statement. That's right. Good. Her voice was flat. You were never really here anyway. I looked up. Jessica, don't. She cut me off. You were always working, always busy. You missed everything. Birthdays, recitals, graduation. You chose the job over us. Every single time. It wasn't like that I stopped. Because how could I explain this? How could I tell her that the reason I was gone was because I was protecting her, that some of the people I was hunting, a few of them, had figured out who I was, where I lived. That in 2011, I'd walked away from everything I'd built because staying would have put her in danger. I couldn't. The agreement I'd signed forbade it, so I stayed silent, and Jessica took that silence as confirmation. You're a disappointment, Dad. She said it quietly, not angry, like she'd been carrying it for years and was finally allowed to set it down. Mom deserved better. We all did. Then she walked back inside. I should have seen it coming. The resentment didn't start in 2016. It started years before that. When Jessica turned 13, we'd planned a small party. Family, a few friends, purple frosting on the cake, because that was her favorite color that year. I was supposed to be home by 4. I didn't make it until 9. The case I was working, a multi-state fraud ring, had broken that afternoon. Arrests were happening. I needed to stay to coordinate, to do the paperwork, the kind of work that doesn't wait for birthdays. When I walked in, the house was dark, except for the kitchen light. Linda sat at the table, arms crossed. The cake was still untouched. The candles melted into the frosting. She cried for an hour, Linda said. After that, she stopped asking where you were. I went upstairs. Jessica's door was closed. I knocked softly. Go away. Jess, I'm sorry. The case. You're always sorry. And there's always a case. Her voice broke. I don't care anymore, Dad. Just go away. I stood there for a long moment. Then I left. The next morning, I tried to make it up to her. Took her to breakfast. Bought her the book she'd wanted. She was polite but distant, like I was a stranger doing her a favor. That was the first crack. 6 years later, I left the FBI. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. Jessica was 19 by then, away at college. I told her I'd changed careers, that I was doing consulting work now. She didn't ask why. By then, she'd stopped asking me anything that mattered. What she didn't know, what I couldn't tell her, was that leaving wasn't a choice. It was survival. A case had gone wrong. The people I was investigating had learned my identity, my family's. There'd been threats. Subtle at first, then explicit. The Bureau offered me a deal. Early retirement, classified records, protection through anonymity. In exchange, I disappeared from public view. Became ordinary. Forgettable. I took it. For her. For Daniel. For Linda. But Jessica saw something different. She saw a man who'd given up. Someone settling. Someone who went from busy to invisible. And over time, invisible became useless. She didn't know that the quiet man who worked from home, who seemed to have lost his ambition, had spent 2 decades catching people who exploited the vulnerable. She didn't know that some of those people had put bounties on federal agents' families. She didn't know that in 2011, her safety had been threatened enough that my supervisor told me to get out or risk losing her. I couldn't tell her any of that. So I became the father who wasn't there, the father who'd failed. By the time Linda and I divorced, Jessica had already written me off. Daniel was more forgiving. He asked questions. tried to understand. But Jessica had made up her mind, and the word she chose was disappointment. The irony was hard to stomach. I'd given up everything to protect her, and she hated me for it. Years later, when I found my father's journal hidden in his bedroom, when I read the shaky handwriting that said, "Jessica asked me to sign something today. I don't understand what it is," I finally understood what I was looking at. I'd spent 22 years investigating financial crimes. I knew what elder exploitation looked like. I knew the patterns, the isolation, the coercion, the intermediaries who helped hide the money trail. And I'd been watching Jessica do every single one of those things to my father. My father had taught me patience. The Bureau had taught me investigation. And somewhere between the garage in 2016 and the journal I found in 2024, I'd learned one more thing. Sometimes the people you love most are capable of the things you'd least expect. And sometimes the only way to save them from themselves is to let the system do what you can't. If there was one person who understood me, it was my father, Victor Bennett. 84 when he died, a retired high school math teacher who balanced his checkbook every Sunday and kept receipts in labeled envelopes. 3 weeks after we buried him, my daughter claimed I'd abandoned him. Let me take you back to 1989. I was 23. My father drove me to the federal building in Portland on my first day. We didn't talk much, but when we pulled into the parking garage, he turned to me. "I'm proud of you, Michael. You're about to see things most people don't see. You're about to carry burdens most people can't. But remember this. Do the right thing even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." At 23, I thought I understood. But I didn't. Not yet. My father taught math for 37 years. He believed in numbers because numbers didn't lie. They added up or they didn't. There was a correctness you couldn't argue with. When I told him I wanted to join the FB, he asked one question. "Why?" "Because I want to catch people who hurt other people." He nodded slowly, like checking my math. "That's a good reason. Don't lose it." I never did. 22 years later, I told him I was leaving the Bureau. About the case. About the threats. About protecting my family. Victor listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You're protecting them." "Yes. And they won't know." "No, they won't." He leaned forward. "Michael, they might not understand. Linda might not understand. Jessica might think you gave up. But I see what you're doing. And it's the hardest thing you've ever had to do." He was right. Linda didn't understand. Jessica saw failure, but Victor saw sacrifice. After I left the Bureau, my father called every Sunday morning, just to talk. He never asked if I regretted leaving. He knew I did. He also knew I'd do it again. Then January 2023 came. Victor had a stroke. Minor, but he'd need help. Jessica started visiting more often. "Dad, I'm stopping by to check on Grandpa. You don't need to come. I've got it covered." At first I was grateful. Maybe this would bring us closer. But Victor seemed cautious, watchful. One afternoon, I stopped by unannounced. Jessica was there with papers spread across the table. "Just some paperwork," she said quickly. "Grandpa's been forgetting to pay bills. I'm helping him get organized." When Jessica left the room, Victor looked at me. "She's very helpful." His tone was careful, but I prompted. He hesitated. "Nothing. Just stay close, Michael." I should have paid attention, but I wanted to believe my daughter was doing something good. Over the next months, Jessica's visits became routine. Victor stopped calling me every Sunday. When I asked why, Jessica said he was tired. I believed her. In June, he called me confused. "Michael, did you get the letter I sent?" "What letter?" "About the accounts. Did you get it?" "No, Dad." "Oh, maybe I forgot to mail it." But he hadn't forgotten. I'd learn later Jessica had promised to mail it for him. She never did. I visited in July. He looked thinner. We sat on his porch. "Gee, Michael, he said quietly. If something happens to me, the lockbox, in my bedroom closet. The code is your birthday. 0428. Dad, you don't need to. Promise me. You'll check it. I promise. I should have checked it then. But I didn't. Victor died in August. Heart attack in his sleep. Quick. Painless. When I went through his house, I found the journal. Notes in increasingly shaky handwriting about Jessica's visits. About papers she'd asked him to sign. About money missing from his account. March 15th, 2023. Jessica visited again. She's asking me to sign papers. I don't fully understand them. Something feels wrong. June 22nd, 2023. I tried to call Michael about the papers Jessica had me sign, but Jessica was here and took my phone. She said I was confused and shouldn't worry Michael. July 30th, 2023. I know now. Jessica has been taking money. I saw the bank statements. Over $180,000. I'm going to leave everything in the lockbox. Michael will know what to do. 3 weeks after we buried him, Jessica filed her petition. I realized too late that everything Jessica had done, she'd done while my father was vulnerable, when he couldn't stop her. But Victor had left a trail. Not for Jessica. For me. In the lockbox, along with the journal, I found recordings. Audio files on a small digital recorder. Conversations between him and Jessica. Timestamps. Dates. Everything documented with the precision of a man who'd spent his life teaching others to show their work. He'd recorded her asking him to sign the power of attorney. Her voice sweet and patient. His voice uncertain, asking if he should talk to me first. Her voice reassuring him that I was too busy, that this was better kept between them. My father had built a case, not the way an investigator would, but the way a teacher would. Step by step. Showing the work, making sure someone would be able to check his calculations and see where things had gone wrong. He'd left it for me, the only person who would know what to do with it. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to Jessica describe me as someone who'd abandoned his father. I thought about that moment in his kitchen, about the careful way he'd said, "She's very helpful," about the wait when he said, "Stay close." My father had tried to warn me, and I'd been too blind to see it, but he'd known I'd eventually understand. That's why he'd left the evidence. Victor Bennett had taught me one final lesson. Sometimes the answer isn't obvious until you go back and check the work. And when you do, you'd better make sure you've shown every step. He'd shown me every step. Now I just had to follow them. The petition arrived on a gray afternoon in late August, 3 weeks after we buried my father. The envelope was thick, formal, addressed to me by my full name. I sat in my car in the parking lot for several minutes before opening it. Rain spattered against the windshield. Early autumn leaves stuck to the glass in wet clumps. Inside was a petition. Legal size. 32 pages. Emergency conservatorship petition. Jessica Bennett, petitioner, requests the court appoint her as temporary financial conservator for Michael Bennett, respondent. Grounds: respondent is incapable of recognizing financial exploitation, incapable of managing assets responsibly, emotionally withdrawn, in need of protection from self-harm through poor decision-making. Self-harm. She was arguing I was a danger to myself. The petition included affidavits. One from a neighbor who said I seemed withdrawn. One from someone I didn't recognize. One from Jessica herself. 4 pages describing a father who'd never been present, who couldn't recognize signs of exploitation. There was no mention of Victor. Not one word about the man who'd actually been exploited. About the $185,000 that had disappeared from his accounts in the 14 months before he died. About the recordings he'd left behind, the journal entries, the careful documentation. Jessica had filed this 3 weeks after we buried him, before the estate had been settled, before anyone could look closely at his accounts. She'd moved fast, strategically, a preemptive strike before I could figure out what she'd done. My phone rang. The bank. Mr. Bennett, we've received a court order. Your accounts are temporarily frozen pending review of the conservatorship petition. Frozen. Completely. I had $200 in cash. That was it. Within 48 hours, my life unraveled with bureaucratic efficiency. My employer called next. Michael, we have to place you on administrative leave, just until this gets sorted out. Standard procedure when there's legal action involved. By Friday, my access to work systems was suspended. My paychecks were held. My credit cards stopped working. I called the bank again. How long? That depends on the court, sir. Could be a few weeks, could be longer. I'd worked in law enforcement long enough to know how these things worked. Emergency orders get issued quickly to protect vulnerable people. Judges err on the side of caution. Jessica had isolated me, financially, professionally. She'd created a situation where I looked exactly like what she'd described. Incapable. That evening, Daniel called. What's going on? Your sister just filed a petition. I know. She told me. She said you need help. That you're not managing things well. That Grandpa, that's not accurate, I said quietly. Then why would she do this? I could have told him. But I didn't have proof yet. I don't know. A long silence. I want to believe you, Dad, but I understand. Do you? Yes. And I did. Jessica had spent years building a narrative. Daniel didn't know which version was real. I have to go, he said. The call ended. I stood there in my small studio apartment and felt the full weight of what Jessica had done. She'd weaponized my own history against me. The absent father. The man who'd stepped down from his career. She'd taken all of that and turned it into a case for incompetence. And she'd done it before I could stop her. That night, I sat by the window and thought about what Jessica had written. Incapable of recognizing financial exploitation. The irony was brutal. Because recognizing exploitation, specifically financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, was exactly what I'd done for 22 years. I'd investigated Ponzi schemes, elder fraud, caretakers who drained the accounts of people they were supposed to protect. I'd built cases that sent people to prison, and now my own daughter had done exactly what I'd spent 2 decades fighting. I opened my laptop, and I started investigating, not with anger, not for revenge, but with the methodical patience I'd applied to hundreds of cases before. Because if Jessica thought she could bury me under paperwork and assumptions, she'd made one fatal mistake. She'd forgotten what I was capable of. The first thing I did was request Victor's bank records. I was listed as beneficiary. I was the executor. I had legal standing to review his financial history. The bank said it would take 3 business days. I could wait. The second thing I did was call Ellen Crawford. She'd worked in the district attorney's office before going into private practice. She knew how these cases worked. Michael, I heard about the petition. I need a lawyer. Come to my office Monday morning, 9 a.m. Bring everything you have. I don't have much yet. Ma, that's fine. We'll build it. Her voice was calm. Michael, I've read the petition. It's aggressive, but it's also sloppy. There are claims that are going to be very hard for her to prove. Good. One question. Does she know who you used to work for? No. Then we have an advantage. I hung up and opened a spreadsheet. Started documenting dates. The day Victor had his stroke. The day Jessica started visiting regularly. The day he'd tried to mail me that letter. The day he'd told me to check the lockbox. I pulled out the journal from his bedroom. Started transcribing entries. Creating a timeline. This was what I knew how to do. Document. Cross-reference. Build a pattern. Let the evidence tell the story. Outside, the rain had picked up. The apartment was cold. I hadn't turned on the heat. Couldn't afford to waste money. But I wasn't thinking about the cold. I was thinking about patterns. About how Jessica's visits had increased after Victor's stroke. about the power of attorney he'd signed in May, about the transfers that started in June, about how she'd been there consistently, helpfully, lovingly for 14 months while his money disappeared, and about how 3 weeks after he died, she'd filed to have me declared incompetent because she knew I'd eventually look at those accounts. She was trying to discredit me before I could, but she'd made one mistake. She'd assumed I wouldn't fight back. By midnight, I had the beginnings of a timeline. By 2 a.m., I had a list of documents I needed. By dawn, I had a plan. Monday morning, I'd meet with Ellen. We'd file a response. But more than that, we'd build a counter case. Not just to defend myself, but to expose what Jessica had done. Because somewhere in those bank records, in those transfers, was the evidence I needed. Victor had left me breadcrumbs. Now I just had to follow them. And when I did, when I had everything documented and undeniable, I was going to do what I'd done 100 times before. I was going to let the system do what it was designed to do. Not for revenge, but because my father had spent his last months being exploited by someone he loved. And because he'd trusted me to do something about it. 3 business days for the bank records. I could wait. I'd been patient this long. I didn't react publicly. I didn't call Jessica. I didn't hire a lawyer yet. I did what I'd been trained to do for 2 decades. Follow the money. The records arrived via secure email on Tuesday. 146 pages. Every transaction from Victor's checking and primary savings accounts for the past 18 months. I printed them, spread them across my kitchen table, got out highlighters, a notebook, and a spreadsheet template I'd used 100 times before. Most of it was routine. Social Security deposits, pension payments, utility bills, prescriptions. The spending pattern of an 84-year-old retired teacher living alone. But starting in May 2023, something changed. Withdrawals, not huge ones. That would have been too obvious. These were calculated. 3,000 here, 4,500 there, then 6,200, 5,800, labeled as administrative support, or care coordination, or consulting services. I highlighted each one. 17 of them over 14 months from May 2023 to July 2024. Then I opened Victor's Google Calendar. He'd asked me to set it up years ago and never revoked my permissions. I cross-referenced the dates. Every withdrawal matched a day Jessica visited Victor. Not most. All. May 18, 2023. Withdrawal of $3,200. Jessica visited to help pay bills. June 3, 2023. Withdrawal of $4,500. Jessica visited to organize files. June 22, 2023. Withdrawal of $5,100. Jessica visited to check on Grandpa's health. 17 visits, 17 withdrawals, total $82,400. But that wasn't all. I found wire transfers. Electronic transfers to a business account registered under Patterson Financial Services. 6 transfers ranging from $12,000 to $28,000. Total $102,600. Combined $185,000. I sat back and looked at the numbers. The pattern was there. Clear. Methodical. Exactly the kind of pattern I'd spent 22 years learning to recognize. Caretaker gains access. Small withdrawals at first testing. Larger amounts as confidence grows. Transfers to an intermediary to obscure the trail. A 14-month timeline corresponding exactly to the period after Victor's stroke when he was most vulnerable. This was textbook elder financial exploitation. I pulled up Patterson Financial Services, a registered LLC in Oregon. Owner Gloria Patterson. Business address a mailbox rental facility. No website, no employees listed. Just a shell company designed to move money. But I needed more than spreadsheets. I needed the legal documents that gave Jessica access. I requested copies of all legal paperwork filed with Victor's bank. It took 24 hours. When they arrived, I found it. Power of attorney, dated May 18th, 2023. Signed by Victor. Notarized. Granting Jessica financial decision-making authority, account access, and the ability to conduct legal transactions on his behalf. May 18th, 2023. The same day as the first withdrawal. I pulled Victor's medical records next. I was still listed as his healthcare proxy. Neurology notes from May 17th, 2023. One day before the power of attorney was signed. Patient 107 days post-stroke. Exhibits increased confusion. Limited executive function. Recommend continued monitoring. Patient fatigued, disoriented to time. She'd had him sign paperwork the day after the doctor noted he was confused. I went back through Victor's medical records looking for relevant notes. I found them scattered throughout summer 2023. June 14th. Patient reports anxiety. Difficulty making decisions. Family member present assisting with healthcare questions. July 22nd. Patient seems withdrawn. Reports sleeping poorly. Family member reports patient has been forgetting medications. August 10th. Cognitive assessment shows mild impairment consistent with post-stroke recovery. Patient has good days and difficult days. Family member very involved in care. The family member was Jessica. She'd been at every appointment. Helpful, concerned, the perfect granddaughter. And she'd been documenting his confusion, building a record that would support the narrative that he needed help. I made a chart. 2 columns. On the left, Victor's medical appointments and notes about his confusion. On the right, withdrawals and transfers from his accounts. The overlap was almost perfect. Every time a doctor noted increased confusion, a withdrawal followed within days. Jessica had been using his medical vulnerability as cover. I spent 3 days building the case. Cross-referencing, documenting, creating exhibits, bank statements, medical records, calendar entries, legal documents, all organized chronologically, all building toward a single conclusion. Jessica Bennett had systematically exploited her grandfather over a 14-month period, using his medical vulnerability to gain legal access and then draining his accounts through direct withdrawals and transfers to an intermediary. But I also knew something else. This still wasn't enough. In court, Jessica would argue that Victor trusted her, that he wanted her help, that the withdrawals were for his care, that Patterson Financial Services was legitimate, that everything was documented and legal. To prove intent, I needed to show that Victor didn't consent, that he was confused, that he tried to resist. And then I remembered. My father had always been meticulous. He documented everything. If he'd suspected something was wrong, he would have written it down. I thought about the lockbox he'd told me about, the one in his bedroom closet. Code 0428. My birthday. I hadn't gone back to the house since the funeral. Jessica had already put it on the market, but the estate was still in probate. It would be months before it sold. Whatever my father had left, if anything, it would still be there. I looked at the clock. Nearly midnight. I'd been working for 6 hours straight, but I wasn't tired. I was close. I could feel it. The way I used to feel when a case was about to break. Victor had left me breadcrumbs, the calendar, the medical records he'd made sure I had access to, the lockbox code he'd made me promise to remember. He'd known something was wrong, and he'd prepared for the possibility that I'd need to figure it out after he was gone. I gathered the spreadsheets, put them in a folder, made backup copies on my laptop and a thumb drive, sent encrypted copies to my email, the habits of someone who'd worked cases where evidence disappeared. Then I grabbed my keys, the house on Cedar Street, the place where my father had lived for 30 years, where he'd raised me, where he'd died alone while someone he loved stole from him. I needed to go back there, not just for evidence, but because if Victor had left me something, the least I could do was find it. I owed him that much. The house on Cedar Street didn't look abandoned, just waiting. I used the key I'd kept since I was 16, the same brass key my father had given me. In case you ever need a place to come home to, he'd said. The smell hit me first. Coffee, old books, lemon polish. My father's smell. I stood in the doorway and let it wash over me. The house was too clean. Someone had tidied up, but they hadn't changed the essence of it. The worn leather chair by the window, the bookshelf with math textbooks, everything exactly where he'd left it. Except him. I walked through the living room, past the kitchen, past the hallway, where framed photographs hung in chronological order. A timeline of a family that didn't exist anymore. His office was at the end of the hall. A small room with a north-facing window and a desk. His laptop sat closed. I opened it. It was still logged in. An email icon blinked. One unread message. From Victor Bennett to Michael Bennett. Subject, if you're reading this. Sent August 12th, 2024, 12:01 a.m. auto-scheduled. My hands were shaking when I clicked it open. The email began with words that made my chest tight. Michael, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I tried to tell you. I called in June, but Jessica was always there. I didn't want to accuse her without proof. I didn't want to tear the family apart if I was wrong. But I'm not wrong. He explained that she'd been asking him to sign things, transfer money, claiming it was to help. He wrote that he wasn't as sharp as he used to be after the stroke, but he wasn't confused enough to miss the patterns. He'd kept records. They were in the house. He trusted me to do the right thing. The email ended with words that broke me. I'm proud of you, son, for everything you've sacrificed. I know what you gave up in 2011. I know why. And I know your kids don't understand it. But I do. Be strong, Dad. Attached were scanned files, documents, photos, bank statements. I sat there staring at the screen and felt something crack open inside me. He'd known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. And he'd been trying to protect me even after he was gone. I walked to the hallway closet. Behind a box of photographs, I found it. A leather-bound journal. Brown softened with use. I opened it to the first entry dated March 15th, 2023. Jessica called today. Said she wants to help more. Sounds sincere. I want to believe it. I kept reading through entries that documented his growing confusion and fear. May 20th. Looked at the papers again. Power of attorney. Didn't mean to give that much control. Then July 30th. I'm not imagining this. She's taking money. But if I accuse her and I'm wrong, I'll ruin Michael's relationship with his daughter. The last entry, dated August 10th, 2024, 2 days before he died, said simply, if you're reading this, something went wrong. I didn't forget who you are. I know what you do. I trust you'll see what I couldn't. Dad. I went back to the office and checked under the desk drawer the way I'd checked 100 hiding spots in 100 investigations. My fingers found it. A USB drive taped to the underside. I pulled it free and plugged it in. 6 audio files, dated between May and July 2024. I put in earbuds and clicked the first one. Jessica's voice was clear and confident, asking Victor if he wanted me to control everything, saying I didn't understand money like she did. Victor's voice was weaker, hesitant, agreeing to sign. Each recording showed the same pattern. Jessica calm and persistent. Victor tired and trusting. In one recording, when Victor asked if he should talk to me, Jessica's response was immediate. Dad's really stressed right now, Grandpa. Let's not worry him with this. In the last recording, dated July 28th, 2 weeks before he died, Victor questioned the bank activity. Jessica cut him off, reminding him he'd signed the power of attorney. I could hear the doubt in his voice, the confusion, the fear of being wrong. I took out the earbuds and sat there in his office chair. On his desk was a photograph of the four of us at Jessica's college graduation. She was grinning arms around both of us. Victor looked so proud. That was 8 years ago before everything fell apart. I picked up the journal again and flipped to the last page. Victor's handwriting was shakier here, the letters uneven. Michael, if you found this, I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't stop her. Sorry I doubted myself. Sorry I left you to clean up my mess. But I knew you would. You always do the right thing, even when it costs you everything. I love you, son. Always have. Always will. Dad. I sat on the floor of my father's office, one hand holding the journal, one hand holding the USB drive. And for the first time since receiving that petition, maybe the first time in years, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quiet tears from a place I'd kept locked for decades. Because my father had known what Jessica was doing, and he'd been too afraid of being wrong, too afraid of destroying his family to say it out loud. So he documented it, left breadcrumbs, trusted that I'd find them and do what he couldn't. Grief doesn't solve cases. I wiped my face, stood, and copied every file to my own drive. Then I made a call to a number I hadn't dialed in 13 years. Thomas Reed answered on the second ring. When I told him I needed help, he said he'd be there in 20 minutes. By the time Thomas arrived, I had everything organized. Email printed, journal entries flagged, audio files queued, bank records cross-referenced. I opened the door and saw Thomas looking older than I remembered, grayer and heavier, but his eyes were still sharp. When I told him what Jessica had done, I handed him the journal. He walked to the kitchen table, spent 5 minutes reviewing everything, then looked up and said it was solid, prosecutable. I told him I needed to build this the right way by the book, so there'd be no loopholes when it went to court. Thomas smiled, not a happy smile, but a predator's smile, and said we had 3 weeks before the hearing. We'd make it bulletproof. I looked back at the kitchen table at my father's journal sitting there in the morning light and nodded. Yeah, let's do that. You look like Hell Bennett. Thomas Reed said it before I'd even stepped through the door. His house sat on a quiet street in the Pinewood suburbs, a ranch-style place with a tidy lawn and a view of the foothills. Rain drizzled from a gray sky, the kind of late September afternoon that felt more like November. I stood on his porch with a messenger bag slung over my shoulder, containing copies of everything I'd found at my father's house that morning. I feel worse than I look, I said. Thomas stepped aside to let me in. 60, now retired from the bureau for 5 years, but he still carried himself like a field agent, broad shoulders, sharp eyes, the readiness that came from 2 decades chasing white-collar criminals through financial labyrinths. We'd worked together in the Portland field office. He knew me in a way most people didn't. He knew why I'd left in 2011, why I'd become a risk consultant instead of staying on the career track. He knew what it had cost. He led me into the living room and poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking if I wanted any. Then he said simply, "Tell me." So I did. I told him about my father's death in August, about the petition Jessica filed 3 weeks later requesting emergency conservatorship, about the frozen bank accounts, the administrative leave from work, the accusations in a courtroom that painted me as incompetent and unstable. I told him about the house on Cedar Street, about the email my father had scheduled to send after his death, about what I'd found in the attic. Thomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set his mug down and leaned back in his chair. "How bad is it?" he asked. I pulled the timeline from my bag and slid it across the coffee table. He studied it for a long moment. Dates, amounts, transaction descriptions, all color-coded and cross-referenced. The kind of forensic breakdown you'd see in a federal case file. 14 months, I said quietly. Systematic withdrawals, wire transfers to a third-party account, all while my father's medical records show progressive cognitive decline. Thomas looked up. How much? $185,000. He exhaled slowly. Jesus, Michael. There's more. I pulled out the journal. He documented it. Every conversation, every visit, every time she asked him to sign something he didn't understand. Thomas flipped through a few pages, his jaw tightening. Then I handed him the USB drive. Recordings, 6 of them. He recorded her in his own home. Conversations about the money, about the power of attorney, about why he couldn't tell me what was happening. Thomas set the drive down carefully like it might detonate. "You know what this means," he said. "I do. Once you move forward with this, once you bring this evidence into court, there's no walking it back. This isn't just a legal fight. This is your daughter." I looked at the rain streaking down the window. "I know." Thomas stood and walked to the bookshelf. He pulled out a business card, studying it for a moment before handing it to me. Ellen Crawford, attorney at Law Criminal Defense, white-collar crime, elder advocacy. She spent 15 years in the DA's office before going private, Thomas said. Prosecuted financial crimes, elder abuse cases, fiduciary fraud. She's the best I've seen at taking something like this. He gestured at the documents spread across his coffee table, and making a jury or a judge understand exactly what it means. You trust her with my life. He paused. And more importantly, with a case like this. Thomas pulled out his phone and dialed. It rang twice before a woman answered. "Ellen, it's Tom Reed. I'm calling about a referral." He glanced at me. "Elder financial abuse case. Conservatorship petition filed by the alleged perpetrator. The respondent is former bureau, and he's got documentation, bank records, journal entries, audio recordings from the victim." A pause. "Very strong," Thomas said, "but complicated. It's his daughter." Another pause. Longer this time. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, I'll let him know." Thomas ended the call and handed me the card. "She'll see you tomorrow. Bring everything." I slid the card into my wallet. Outside, the rain had picked up, drumming steadily against the roof. Thomas looked at me, his expression serious. "Are you sure about this, Michael?" I stood and slung the bag over my shoulder. "Jessica spent 14 months taking my father's money while he was dying. Then she filed a petition claiming I abandoned him. She stood in a courtroom and told a judge I was incompetent, that I'd lost my job, that I was a danger to myself." I met Thomas's eyes. "I'm not the man she thinks I am, Tom, and it's time she learned that." Thomas walked me to the door. He put a hand on my shoulder as I stepped out into the rain. "Then go show them," he said. I drove home through the wet streets, windshield wipers cutting arcs through the drizzle. In 2 weeks, I'd be sitting in a courtroom while my daughter tried to convince a judge I couldn't manage my own life. But tomorrow morning, I'd walk into Ellen Crawford's office with 146 pages of bank records, a handwritten journal, 6 audio files, and a timeline that showed exactly what my father had seen. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. The silence had been strategy. Now it was time to act. Ellen Crawford didn't waste time on pleasantries. When I walked into her office at 9 o'clock sharp, she pointed to the chair across from her desk and said, "Show me what you have." Her office occupied the 3rd floor of an old brick building in downtown Pinewood, with windows overlooking wet streets where morning commuters hunched under umbrellas. The interior was all dark wood and leather, the kind of space built for serious work. Ellen herself was 45, sharp-featured, with short brown hair and rimless glasses, wearing a charcoal suit and no jewelry except a watch. I spread everything across her conference table: bank statements with highlighted transactions. The power of attorney document dated May 18, 2023. Victor's medical records from May 17, showing increasing confusion, the timeline cross-referencing dates and amounts, my father's journal, and the USB drive containing 6 audio recordings. For the next 45 minutes, Ellen read every page, listened to each recording through headphones, and studied the financial timeline, making notes and cross-referencing dates. I waited, knowing good lawyers never rushed analysis. Finally, she removed her glasses and looked at me. "Mr. Bennett, this isn't just conservatorship abuse. This is criminal financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a Class B felony in Oregon. With this amount of money, we're talking about first-degree elder abuse. I pulled a sealed envelope from my messenger bag and placed it on the desk between us. "You'll need this," I said. "But not yet." Ellen looked at the envelope, then at me. "What's in here?" "One of my credentials. Everything you'll need to establish that I'm not the person my daughter says I am." She reached for it. I put my hand on top. "Save it for court." Ellen studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded and slid the envelope into her briefcase without opening it. "If this is what I think it is, we have a very strong case." Ellen leaned back in her chair and outlined the situation. Jessica had filed first and was controlling the narrative. In 12 days, I'd walk into a courtroom where she'd painted me as incompetent. But if we were strategic, we wouldn't just win the conservatorship hearing, we'd trigger a criminal investigation that ran independently of me. The key was not to accuse Jessica directly, but to let the system discover it on its own. She sketched out the strategy on her legal pad. First, we'd file a comprehensive counterpetition, attaching my background and credentials. That alone would give the judge pause. Second, we'd notify Adult Protective Services, not saying my daughter committed a crime, but expressing concerns about potential financial irregularities involving a deceased elder. A PS had a legal obligation to investigate and would find the pattern themselves. Third, we'd request a court-ordered comprehensive financial review. The bank would flag the transactions independently and be required to report to APS and potentially law enforcement. "So you let the system do the work," I said, understanding the elegance of it. When I walked into that courtroom, I wouldn't be making accusations. I'd be the responsible son who discovered irregularities and reported them to appropriate authorities. Ellen checked Jessica's attorney, Mark Sullivan, a mid-tier lawyer who did family law and estate work. He was competent, but not specialized, and if Jessica told him I was just a risk consultant, he probably didn't dig deeper. He wouldn't expect what was in that envelope, and when it got revealed, the judge would realize his client had misled him by omission. That credibility drop mattered. Ellen needed to be clear about something. Once we started this process, it would escalate. The DA's office would likely get involved, Jessica would face criminal charges, and our family would be torn apart in ways that couldn't be quickly repaired. I thought about Victor's journal, his voice in those recordings, the trust he'd placed in me. "My father already prepared me," I said. Ellen nodded and told me what came next. She needed signed authorization documents, copies of everything, and a detailed affidavit. We had 12 days, enough time to position the pieces. I was to live quietly, not contact Jessica, not announce anything, or post on social media and let the system wake up around her. When we walked into that courtroom, I needed to trust her completely, let her control the narrative even when I wanted to speak or defend myself. Ellen walked me to the door, confirming she'd file the counter-petition that afternoon, send APS notification tomorrow, and have bank subpoenas ready by week's end. By October 15th, the judge would be asking questions Jessica didn't prepare for. When I left her office, rain streaked the windows as people hurried past under umbrellas. My life was about to change permanently, but for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt something other than grief. I felt ready. Ellen called late that evening while I sat in my studio apartment, with copies of my father's journal spread across the kitchen table. "A PS has been notified," she said without preamble. "New bank subpoenas are being prepared. The system is in motion." By the time I walked into that courtroom, the judge would have questions my daughter couldn't answer. Ellen reminded me that once the evidence was presented, there was no going back. Jessica would face consequences she didn't anticipate. She made her choice when she filed that petition, I said quietly. Now she'll live with it. After she hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to rain against the window. Somewhere across town, Jessica was probably sleeping soundly, confident in her narrative. She didn't know that Adult Protective Services had opened a file that a judge would soon review, financial records her own attorney hadn't seen, or that the man she'd called incompetent had been building a case from the moment he found his father's journal. In 12 days, the evidence would speak. I wasn't surprised when the email arrived. 3 days after my meeting with Ellen, the subject line read, "Account Activity Review Required. Victor Bennett Estate." The message was formal, carefully worded in the language banks use when they found something wrong, but need to protect themselves legally. It referenced unusual activity patterns during the 14 months preceding Victor Bennett's death, and requested that the legal heir contact the bank's compliance office within 5 business days. I forwarded it to Ellen without comment. Her reply came back in less than 10 minutes. Perfect. This is exactly what we needed. I sat in my studio apartment, the same space where I'd spread out those bank records 2 weeks ago, and watched the morning light filter through the window. Outside, a light fog clung to the streets of Pinewood, the kind of early autumn mist that turned everything soft and gray. The machinery had started moving, and just like Ellen predicted, it was moving independently of me. The second email arrived that afternoon, from Paula Harris. Adult Protective Services subject. Case number 2. 024-09-APS-1847. Investigation opened. Ellen had CC'd me on her initial response to APS attaching medical documentation showing cognitive decline beginning May 17, 2023. The power of attorney executed May 18, one day. Later bank records showing systematic withdrawals, personal journal entries from Victor expressing concerns, and audio recordings documenting conversations about money. The language was measured and professional, void of accusation. Ellen had structured it perfectly, not pointing fingers, but presenting concerns and evidence, letting the system draw its own conclusions. By the end of the week, those conclusions were forming. Paula Harris called Ellen directly, while I was in her office reviewing the counter-petition we'd be filing Monday morning. Based on the documentation you provided, Paula's voice came through the speakerphone flat and professional. I'm opening a formal investigation into potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Ellen glanced at me. I kept my expression neutral. The pattern is consistent with what we call structured diversion, Paula continued, using an intermediary to obscure direct transfers. You mentioned a Gloria Patterson. Yes, transactions were processed through her business account. We've seen this before. A trusted friend or family member processing transactions, taking a fee, creating distance between the victim and the ultimate beneficiary. Paula paused. The fee structure you documented, 8 to 10%, is within the range we typically see in exploitation schemes. I sat very still, listening to the clinical dissection of what my daughter had done. I'll need to interview Mr. Bennett directly, Paula said. And I'll be requesting full cooperation from the petitioner's legal representation regarding the source of funds used to file the conservatorship petition. Ellen's eyes met mine. Mr. Bennett is available for interview at your convenience. After the call ended, Ellen set her phone down and leaned back in her chair. The fog had lifted outside, but the autumn light remained muted, filtering through the window in pale, uncertain shades. The system is working, she said quietly. I didn't respond immediately, because I was thinking about the calls I'd been getting. 7 missed calls in the past 2 days, all from Jessica. The voicemails started angry, accusatory. To Dad, what did you tell the bank? They're asking me questions about Grandpa's accounts. What the hell is going on? Then they shifted. I don't understand why they're investigating me. I was just trying to help Grandpa. You know that. You have to explain to them it's a misunderstanding. By the third message, she was pleading. Dad, please, just call them off. Tell them you were confused, that you made a mistake. We can fix this. I'd listened to each message 3 times. Then I deleted them. Ellen must have seen something in my face. This is the hardest part, she said quietly. Watching someone you love face consequences. I looked out the window. She knew what she was doing. The recordings proved that. The journal entries proved that. Ellen leaned forward. The system moves slowly, but it moves toward justice. That evening, Thomas Reed called. How are you holding up? I was heating up leftovers in the microwave, staring at the rotating plate. I'm fine. Now Jessica's been calling you 7 times in 2 days. Don't talk to her. Not until after the hearing. His voice was firm. Anything you say could be used against you, or give her time to prepare a defense. I know. There was a pause. Then Tom said, It's different when it's your daughter. I thought about that. Yeah, it is. But the evidence is the evidence. And you've always trusted evidence more than words. After we hung up, I stood at my window for a long time looking out at the street below. Somewhere across town, Jessica was panicking. The bank was asking questions. A PS was investigating. And her attorney, Mark Sullivan, was probably starting to realize his client hadn't told him the whole story. The final voicemail came through just after 10 that night. Jessica's voice was different this time. Colder. More controlled. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're going to regret this. I'm still your daughter. I have rights. And when we go to court, the judge is going to see who you really are, someone who abandoned his own father and now wants to blame me for trying to help. A pause. You taught me to fight for what's mine, so that's what I'm going to do. I stood in the dark with the phone in my hand. In 2 weeks, we'd be in court. Jessica thought she was walking into a probate formality. She didn't know that Paula Harris would be submitting a preliminary report. She didn't know that the bank's compliance office had flagged her transactions independently. She didn't know that a deputy DA named Kevin Marshall had reviewed the case file and called it a textbook example of elder financial exploitation. Most of all, she didn't know who her father really was. Ellen had told me to stay quiet, to let the system work, to trust that evidence would speak louder than accusations. So I deleted the voicemail, turned off my phone, and went to bed. In 2 weeks, the truth would have its day. October 29th, 2024. 9 a.m. Courtroom 4, a Pinewood County courthouse. 2 weeks had passed since Jessica stood in this room and called me incompetent. 2 weeks since Judge Holland ordered a temporary freeze on joint accounts and continued the hearing. 2 weeks since I walked out of this courtroom knowing exactly what was coming. Now I was back. Same oak paneling, same fluorescent hum, same seat. But everything else had changed. The gallery had filled slightly, 5 or 6 people scattered across the benches. Probably local reporters, court watchers, people who'd heard whispers that this conservatorship case wasn't what it seemed. Judge Raymond Holland entered, and we rose. When he gestured for us to sit, I caught Jessica's profile 3 rows ahead. Her posture was straight confident, but I'd spent years reading people across tables. I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand kept adjusting the collar of her blouse. She was worried. Judge Holland announced we were continuing the emergency conservatorship petition filed by Jessica Bennett. Mark Sullivan stood to present. He moved to a presentation screen and clicked a remote. A photograph appeared. Me alone in a grocery store produce section looking tired and gaunt. Mark's voice was smooth, practiced. Your Honor, this image shows Mr. Bennett appearing disoriented and isolated, struggling with basic daily activities. Another slide. Me on a park bench, hands in my lap, staring at the ground. Further evidence of social withdrawal and disengagement. A third slide. A financial chart showing transactions in my account designed to look chaotic. Irregular financial patterns, suggesting a man who has lost the ability to manage his affairs responsibly. Ellen objected. Your Honor, where were these photographs obtained? Mark didn't hesitate. These were taken in public spaces, Your Honor. Grocery stores, public parks, sidewalks. There's no expectation of privacy. They're observations of Mr. Bennett's daily life documenting behavior that supports this petition. Judge Holland glanced at the photos, then at Ellen. I'll allow it, but establish relevance quickly, counselor. Mark gestured to Jessica, who stood. Her expression was carefully composed, concern mixed with determination. The kind of look that says, I'm doing this because I have no choice. Your Honor, my father stopped responding to my calls. He isolated himself completely. He wouldn't let me help, wouldn't let me check on him. I filed this petition because I genuinely feared for his well-being. Her voice carried just the right note of sincerity. But I watched her hands gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. Judge Holland leaned forward. Ms. Bennett, in your petition, you stated your father lost his employment. Can you clarify those circumstances? Jessica's smile didn't falter, but I saw the pause. He was let go from his position as a risk analyst, Your Honor. I believe it was performance-related. You believe... Well, he didn't discuss it with me directly. But that's part of the problem, Your Honor. He doesn't communicate anymore. He's withdrawn from everyone who cares about him. Judge Holland's eyes shifted to me. Mr. Bennett, I kept my voice steady, clear. That characterization is inaccurate, Your Honor. I was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review, a review related to this conservatorship filing. That review concluded 2 weeks ago. I was cleared of any wrongdoing. My employer extended a formal apology and offered full reinstatement. The courtroom went very quiet. Jessica turned in her seat, staring at me with something close to shock. Judge Holland made a note. So to be clear, you did not lose your job due to incompetence. You were placed on leave as a procedural matter, which has since been resolved in your favor. Correct, Your Honor. Mark Sullivan shifted his weight. I saw the flicker the moment he realized the narrative was cracking. Judge Holland turned back to Jessica. Ms. Bennett, you've stated your father exhibits cognitive decline. Do you have medical documentation supporting this claim? Not formal documentation, Your Honor, but his behavior over the past 2 years. So no medical evaluation has been conducted. No, Your Honor. No neurological assessment. No physician's report. No, Your Honor, but... Then on what basis are you requesting full financial authority over your father's assets? Jessica glanced at Mark. Mark looked at his notes. Your Honor, Mark said, standing quickly. We believe the totality of circumstances, the social withdrawal, the financial irregularities, the refusal to communicate warrant immediate protective action. Judge Holland's expression hardened. Counselor, this is an emergency conservatorship petition. That standard requires a showing of imminent danger. I'm not seeing evidence of imminent danger in what you've presented. Your Honor, we believe... Do you have documentation showing Mr. Bennett is in immediate physical jeopardy, financial jeopardy, evidence of reckless spending, unpaid bills, threats to his housing or safety? Mark hesitated. Not at this time, Your Honor. So then I'm struggling to understand the emergency. Jessica's hands tightened on the table edge. Her breathing was shallow, controlled. She was beginning to understand that the story she'd built wasn't holding. Judge Holland turned to Ellen. Ms. Crawford, does your client wish to present anything? Ellen stood, calm, precise. Yes, Your Honor. We have significant evidence that directly contradicts the characterization of Mr. Bennett as mentally or financially incapacitated. We also have evidence regarding the true circumstances surrounding this petition. She opened her folder and walked to the bench, placing several documents in front of the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to begin by clarifying my client's professional background. It's relevant in ways that may not be immediately apparent. Judge Holland picked up the documents. I watched his expression shift as he read. Surprise, then understanding, then something harder. FBI credentials, letters of commendation, awards from the Financial Crimes Division, Documentation of service from 1989 to 2011. He looked at the papers, then at me, then at Mark Sullivan. Counselor Sullivan, were you aware of this? Mark's face went pale. I was informed Mr. Bennett worked in risk assessment, Your Honor. He does work in risk assessment. Judge Holland's voice went cold. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. For 22 years. The courtroom was silent. Jessica stood suddenly. Judge Holland raised his hand. Ms. Bennett, sit down and listen very carefully to what Ms. Crawford has to say next. Jessica sat slowly. Ellen looked at me. I gave her a single nod. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, Mr. Bennett didn't lose his ability to manage finances. He's a forensic accountant who spent 2 decades investigating financial fraud, Ponzi schemes, and elder exploitation. She paused, letting the words settle. And he's been investigating this case since the day his father died. Judge Holland set the documents down and leaned back in his chair. Rain drummed softly against the courtroom windows. Ms. Crawford, he said quietly. I think we need to hear everything you have. Ellen opened a second folder. Thicker, heavier. Your Honor, I'd like to approach with additional evidence. As Ellen walked toward the bench, I allowed myself to glance at Jessica. She was staring straight ahead, her face unreadable, but her hands were still gripping the table, and I knew she finally understood. The silence hadn't been weakness. It had been strategy. Judge Holland looked directly at Mark Sullivan and asked the question that changed everything. Counselor, are you certain you understand who Mr. Bennett actually is? Mark hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw my daughter's case begin to crumble. The judge's question hung in the air as Mark glanced at his notes, then at Jessica, then back at the bench. He was competent at family law and probate disputes, but wasn't prepared for this. When he explained they'd verified my employment history as a risk analyst for several corporations, Judge Holland interrupted, asking what I did before my private sector work. Mark opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at Jessica again. Judge Holland's voice turned colder, as he demanded to know if Mark had conducted comprehensive background investigation before filing a petition accusing me of being mentally incompetent, pointing out that standard due diligence wasn't what he'd asked for. The courtroom fell silent as I sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table. This was the moment Ellen and I had planned for when the narrative would shift completely. There was no going back now. Ellen rose calm and deliberate and asked to clarify the record. With Judge Holland's permission, she explained that I served with the FBI for 22 years, from 1989 to 2011 in the Financial Crimes Division, specializing in elder financial exploitation, Ponzi schemes, corporate fraud, and money laundering. She displayed my FBI badge photograph on the presentation screen and revealed that I led 47 successful federal prosecutions, received 3 commendations from the Department of Justice, and developed training protocols for identifying elder abuse patterns still used by the Bureau today. She explained that in 2011, I took early retirement under circumstances requiring protective measures for my family due to security threats from a high-stakes case, with certain aspects of my service record remaining sealed. When Judge Holland asked why my FBI service wasn't disclosed to my family, Ellen explained it was for their safety. In 2011, when I retired, Jessica was 19 and Daniel was 17, both young, during the period when security concerns were most acute. To protect them, I never disclosed the full nature of my work, telling my children only that I'd transitioned to private sector risk assessment. Ellen stated clearly that Jessica never knew her father was an FBI agent, specializing in the exact type of financial crime now at the center of this case. Whispers erupted in the gallery behind me. Jessica's voice was barely audible. Dad. I didn't turn around, keeping my eyes forward on Judge Holland and Ellen. I'd made a choice 24 years ago to protect my family by keeping secrets. And now one of those secrets was being used to save me from my own daughter. Jessica stood suddenly, her chair scraping the floor, insisting she didn't know any of this, and he never told her. Judge Holland commanded her to sit down, and when she protested that it didn't change anything, his tone went flat and commanding, ordering her to sit again. Jessica sat, her hands shaking visibly. I looked at my daughter and saw the exact moment she understood what she'd done. She'd tried to declare an FBI financial crimes investigator mentally incompetent to manage money and accused a man who'd spent 2 decades catching people exactly like her of being incapable of recognizing financial exploitation. Ellen let the silence stretch before continuing, explaining that I'd been conducting my own investigation since Victor passed away in August, applying the same methodologies I used for 22 years with the Bureau. What I found wasn't a man in cognitive decline, but a carefully orchestrated scheme of financial exploitation targeting a vulnerable elderly adult. She paused before stating quietly that the person at the center of that scheme was my daughter. Whispers erupted louder as Mark whispered urgently to Jessica, who shook her head violently, her face pale. Judge Holland tapped his gavel for order and acknowledged Ellen was making very serious allegations. Ellen confirmed she had evidence to support every one of them, removing a sealed envelope and laptop from a thick folder. She explained that Victor left behind extensive documentation before he passed a handwritten journal covering his final 14 months email correspondence sent on delay after his death, audio recordings made in his home, and comprehensive bank records showing exactly where his money went. When Judge Holland asked about the audio recordings, Ellen explained that Oregon is a one-party consent state, making Victor's recordings of conversations in his own home fully admissible under Oregon law. There were 6 recordings made between March 2023 and 3 weeks before Victor's death. Ellen requested permission to play the first recording from May 18, 2023, the day Victor signed the power of attorney, granting Jessica control over his finances. Judge Holland denied Mark's request for a recess and told Ellen to proceed. Ellen connected the laptop to the courtroom sound system. After a soft hiss of static, Victor's voice filled the room, weak, elderly, but unmistakably him, expressing confusion about why he needed to sign something. Jessica's voice came next, younger and sweeter, but with an edge, calling it a formality to make things easier as he got older. When Victor mentioned he was managing fine and that I should be involved since I understood financial matters, Jessica insisted firmly that I didn't need to know, that I was too busy with my own problems, and that it was simpler this way. After a long pause, Victor agreed, and the sound of pen on paper was unmistakable. The recording stopped. The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Holland looked at Jessica, whose face was white. Her lips pressed into a thin line and suggested she seriously reconsider her petition. When Mark requested a recess, Judge Holland denied it and ordered Ellen to proceed. Ellen explained that the recording was dated May 18, 2023, the same day the power of attorney was notarized, and that the day before, Victor's physician noted in medical records that he was experiencing increased confusion and memory difficulties following a recent minor stroke. She displayed the medical chart, pointing out that Victor signed away control of his finances less than 24 hours after his doctor documented cognitive impairment, at his granddaughter's urging without his son's knowledge. This was textbook elder financial exploitation, and it was only the beginning. Ellen turned to face Jessica directly before looking back at Judge Holland, revealing there were 5 more recordings. A 14-month timeline showing $185,000 disappearing from Victor's accounts, and a forensic analysis I prepared using 22 years of experience investigating exactly this type of crime. "It's time," Ellen said quietly, "to tell Victor Bennett's story." The judge nodded and told her to proceed. "Before I reveal what was inside that second folder, I want to ask you something. On a scale of 1 to 10, how curious are you about what's about to happen next? Be honest with me in the comments. I read them, and it tells me you're still here with me. And one quick note before we continue: the next part of this story includes some dramatized elements woven in for narrative impact. If that's not something you're comfortable with, this is a good place to pause the video. Otherwise, let's continue. My father's voice filled the courtroom, old, tired, confused, but not too confused to know he was being manipulated, and not too confused to leave a record. Ellen moved to the second recording made on July 12, 2023, approximately 2 months after the power of attorney was executed. Victor's voice came through weak, mentioning a bank notice about a large withdrawal. Jessica explained she'd moved $15,000 temporarily and would put it back once she sorted out her accounts. When Victor suggested talking to me, Jessica's tone shifted harder and more insistent, warning that if he kept questioning her, I would take over everything, put him in a home, and control all his money. After a long pause, Victor agreed to trust her. The recording ended. I stared at my hands folded on the table. I'd heard this recording before alone in my father's house, but hearing it in open court with Jessica 3 rows ahead made it real in a way I hadn't been prepared for. Ellen advanced to the third recording made on March 8, 2024, 5 months before Victor's death. Victor mentioned the bank calling about activity and transfers he didn't remember authorizing. Jessica sounded defensive and irritated, reminding him she was managing his finances with his permission. When Victor insisted on talking to me, Jessica refused, sharply telling him I didn't understand and would just upset him. She reminded him he'd signed the power of attorney and that she was in charge now. The recording ended with the sound of a door closing and my father alone. Ellen explained these recordings documented a pattern of isolation, coercion, and exploitation of cognitive vulnerability. With the court's permission, she read 3 entries from Victor's handwritten journal aloud. The first, from March 15, 2023, expressed confusion about legal documents Jessica brought, and a feeling that something was wrong despite wanting to trust her. The second, from June 22, 2023, described how Jessica took his phone when he tried to call me, saying he was confused and shouldn't worry me with things he didn't understand, leaving him feeling scared rather than confused. The third entry, dated July 30, 2024, just 8 days before my father died, revealed he knew Jessica had been taking money over $180,000 and had left everything in the lockbox for me because he was afraid of being wrong and destroying our family. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear someone crying softly in the gallery. Judge Holland asked if Jessica knew her grandfather was keeping these records, but she didn't answer, staring at the screen at her grandfather's handwriting with her mouth open. Ellen pulled up an email scheduled for delivery after Victor's death. In it, my father explained, he tried to tell me in June, but Jessica was at his house and stopped him, took his phone, said I was too busy. He apologized for not being braver, explained he'd kept records and recordings in the lockbox with the code being my birthday, and trusted me to do what was right. I put my head down just for a moment, just long enough to breathe. Ellen presented my comprehensive forensic analysis, showing $185,000 diverted over 14 months through 17 separate transactions every 2 to 4 weeks. The methods included $23,000 in direct cash withdrawals and $162,000 in wire transfers via Gloria Patterson, a 45-year-old woman who operated a small financial consulting business in Pinewood. Patterson retained 8 to 10% of each transfer as a processing fee, approximately $14,580, then dispersed the remaining funds to Jessica through smaller transactions designed to avoid detection. When Judge Holland asked where Patterson was, now Ellen explained she'd provided a sworn statement to Adult Protective Services 3 weeks ago and was cooperating fully with the investigation. Ellen turned to face the courtroom and stated this was textbook elder financial exploitation with a power of attorney obtained under questionable circumstances. Progressive isolation of the victim, from family use of an intermediary to obscure the money trail, and total exploitation of $185,000 over 14 months. Victor Bennett knew what was happening to him and left us everything we needed to prove it. Jessica stood suddenly, her chair scraping loud against the floor, insisting she was helping him, and he couldn't manage his own affairs. Judge Holland ordered her to sit down, but she refused, her face red with tears streaming, accusing me of twisting everything, of abandoning the family, and never being there when they needed me. Mark Sullivan tried to stop her, but she yanked away and faced me directly, shouting that I chose my job over them and strangers over my own family. Judge Holland slammed his gavel and threatened to hold her in contempt. Jessica collapsed back into her chair and buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I looked at my daughter, broken-cornered, exposed, and felt something twist in my chest. She was right about one thing. I hadn't been there enough, with 22 years of late nights and closed doors, missed birthdays, and phone calls cut short. I'd been catching criminals while my daughter learned to become one. But that didn't excuse what she'd done to my father. Judge Holland asked if Jessica wished to withdraw the petition. When Mark requested time to reconsider, the judge denied the request and stated he'd heard enough. He denied the petition for emergency conservatorship with prejudice and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential criminal violations, including elder, financial abuse, fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Holland looked directly at Jessica and strongly advised her to retain criminal defense counsel immediately before adjourning court. Jessica sat frozen, staring at nothing, while Mark Sullivan packed his briefcase with a carefully neutral face. Ellen told me it was over, and I'd done it, but it didn't feel like victory. As the courtroom emptied, I moved toward the exit and saw two people in dark suits with badges clipped to their belts near the courthouse entrance. One woman with short gray hair made eye contact with me and gave a small nod. Adult Protective Services wasn't here for me, they were here for Jessica. In the elevator, Ellen explained the DA's office would likely file charges within 2 weeks since APS had submitted their report. The bank's fraud department flagged the transactions independently, and Gloria Patterson's statement sealed it. She softened her voice to tell me I'd done the right thing, and my father trusted me to see this through. As the elevator doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of Jessica still sitting alone at the defense table with her head in her hands. The system had taken over now, and I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or heartbroken. The courtroom was empty. The reporters were gone, the lawyers were gone, Jessica was gone. Only I remained sitting in the same chair I'd occupied all morning, staring at the empty judge's bench and the vacant witness stand, surrounded by the silence that filled the space where my father's voice had been just hours before. I thought I'd feel relief or anger or at least satisfaction, but all I felt was hollow. My father was gone, my daughter might go to prison, and I was the one who'd set it all in motion. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and Ellen Crawford stepped inside with her briefcase. She asked if I was okay, and I nodded, not trusting my voice. She walked down the aisle and sat beside me, and for a moment neither of us spoke, while the courtroom clock ticked steadily above the judge's bench. When she said I'd done the right thing, I asked why it didn't feel right. She was silent before explaining that it was because I was a good father even when my daughter wasn't a good daughter. And while that didn't make it easier, in fact it made it harder, it didn't make it wrong. Ellen and I met briefly in her office before I left. She explained that Adult Protective Services had officially opened a full investigation with Paula Harris coordinating with the district attorney's office, and they'd share findings within 2 weeks. Kevin Marshall, the deputy DA, was reviewing the case for criminal charges and would likely pursue 3 counts elder financial exploitation as a Class B felony in Oregon, fraudulent use of power of attorney as Class B, and potentially identity theft. The decision on whether to file charges would come in 4 to 6 weeks, maybe sooner, given how strong the evidence was. Pinewood Community Bank had frozen all accounts associated with the case and would require documentation from me to restore access to Victor's estate. Ellen closed her laptop and told me that from this point forward, it was out of my hands, and my job now was to take care of myself. When I asked about Jessica, Ellen explained she'd need a criminal defense attorney since Mark Sullivan had already filed a withdrawal motion, but that wasn't my responsibility. I said quietly that she was still my daughter. And Ellen's voice softened as she acknowledged that, but reminded me Jessica made her choices, and I couldn't protect her from the consequences, only protect myself from being destroyed by them. I left Ellen's office just after 3 and drove to Cedar Street in quiet with no radio or distractions. Victor's house sat at the end of a tree-lined block, a one-story wooden structure painted faded cream with an unmowed lawn covered in brown maple leaves. The flower pot my father had planted last spring sat beside the doorframe with long dead marigolds, their dried stalks brittle in the cold air. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled like old wood and closed-up spaces with dust hanging in pale shafts of sunlight. The living room looked exactly as it had 3 weeks ago. My father's armchair by the window, the coffee table with crossword puzzle books, the wall clock still ticking steadily above the mantel. Time kept moving even when the person who'd lived here didn't. On the side table I found what I'd come for, a small wooden box containing my father's personal effects, including his reading glasses, letters from my mother written decades ago, and beneath them, wrapped in soft cloth, the pocket watch. It was silver and tarnished with age inscribed on the back, with words from Victor's father about always having time for what matters. Victor had told me once years ago that he wanted me to have it when he was gone, and I'd forgotten about that conversation until now. I held the watch in my hand and felt its weight still running because my father must have wound it just days before he died. I whispered into the empty room that I didn't save him and I was sorry. On the mantel I noticed a framed photograph from 2010, probably Thanksgiving, showing my father standing in the center with one arm around me and the other around Daniel, while Jessica stood beside me smiling at 18 years old with her whole life ahead of her. She'd been in college, then studying business, bright and ambitious and full of plans. I wanted to know where that girl went. Or maybe she'd always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. I took the pocket watch and left the house, locking the door behind me as the sun lowered and shadows lengthened. By the time I got back to my studio apartment, it was nearly 6:30. I heated leftover soup and ate standing at the counter, then sat at the small table by the window, staring at nothing. My phone buzzed at 6:45 with an unknown number and local area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Daniel's voice came through tight and careful, saying he'd heard about the hearing because it was all over the local news. He asked to meet tomorrow because there was something I needed to know. I hesitated because Daniel had taken Jessica's side when the conservatorship petition was filed and called me 3 weeks ago asking why I couldn't just let it go and work things out privately. When I tried to explain, he hadn't believed me, but his voice cracked as he pleaded and apologized for not believing me before, so I agreed to meet at Pinewood Diner at 10 tomorrow morning. After he hung up, I sat in the darkening apartment with the phone still in my hand, thinking that at least I hadn't lost all my children, not yet. At 8:15, my laptop chimed with a new email from Paula Harris at Adult Protective Services informing me that their investigation into the financial exploitation of Victor Bennett had been escalated to the district attorney's office with sufficient evidence to recommend criminal charges against Jessica Bennett and potentially other parties involved. I read the email twice, then closed the laptop and turned off the desk lamp. The apartment went dark, except for streetlights outside casting amber glow and long rectangular shadows across the floor. Somewhere in the city, Jessica was facing. What I'd set in motion somewhere, Daniel was preparing to tell me something I apparently needed to know. And somewhere in a cemetery across town, my father rested finally free from the manipulation that had marked his final months. I thought about the recording we'd played in court with Victor's voice, confused, but aware, asking if he should talk to me, and Jessica cutting him off, saying Dad doesn't need to know about this. My father had written that he trusted me to do what was right. I had done the right thing, but why did it hurt so much? The Pinewood Diner sat on the corner of 4th and Main, the kind of place that had been serving coffee and eggs since before I was born, with vinyl booths, laminate tables, and a menu that hadn't changed in 30 years. I arrived 5 minutes early out of habit, But Daniel was already there, sitting in a window booth with hands wrapped around an untouched coffee mug. When he looked up and saw me, I barely recognized him, with his red, swollen eyes, wrinkled shirt, like he'd slept in it, and hair standing up in places where he'd been running his hands through it. On the table in front of him, next to the untouched coffee, was a single piece of paper. His voice cracked as he greeted me, and when I slid into the booth across from him and asked if he was okay, he shook his head and said he needed to show me something. After the waitress took my coffee order, Daniel pushed the paper across the table and explained he'd gone to Grandpa's house yesterday afternoon when the real estate agent let him in because Jessica was selling it. He'd wanted to say goodbye and went up to the attic where he found an old trunk with Victor's stuff from when he was younger. Inside was a shoebox with Daniel's name written on top in marker, like Victor knew someday he'd look there. And inside was a letter from Grandpa to him. I picked up the lined notebook paper, carefully slightly yellowed with Victor's handwriting, careful and deliberate with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years teaching mathematics. The letter began by acknowledging that if Daniel was reading this, Victor was gone, and something had gone wrong with Jessica. Victor explained that in 2011 I left the FBI. Not because I wanted to or because I failed, but because the case I was working on became dangerous. Bad people found out who I was and where I lived, and made threats against me, against Daniel's mother, against him and Jessica. I had a choice to stay and risk their safety or leave and protect them, so I chose to leave. I gave up a career I'd built over 22 years, gave up promotions and recognition, and the pension I'd earned, and became invisible and ordinary so they could be safe. I never told them, because I didn't want them to carry that burden or feel guilty. I just wanted them to live. Victor wrote that Jessica didn't know this and thought I gave up and failed, but I was the bravest man he'd ever known, not because I fought, but because I knew when to stop fighting. He asked Daniel not to blame me for what I must do if something happened to him and Jessica was involved. Because I was doing what he taught me, protect the people you love even when they don't understand. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back across the table. Daniel was crying now without trying to hide it, apologizing and saying he should have known and should have believed me. He explained he let Jessica convince him that I didn't care and was the problem, but then he watched the trial because someone recorded it and posted it online. He saw the evidence, the journal, the recordings, and realized she lied to him about everything, about Grandpa, about me, about why I left the FBI. He said I gave up everything for them, and he believed her when she said I didn't care. I reached across the table and put my hands on his shoulders, telling him firmly that he wasn't at fault in this because she was his sister, and he wanted to believe her, which wasn't failure, but love. He was 28 years old now, but only 15 when I left the bureau without the full picture. So how could he have known when he said he could have asked me? I pointed out I would have lied to protect him, just like I'd been doing for 13 years. Daniel's face crumpled, and then he broke completely. I stood and moved around to his side of the booth, pulling him into a hug, the first real embrace we'd had in years. He sobbed against my shoulder while I held him and let him release whatever he'd been carrying. When he finally pulled back with ragged but steadier breathing, he asked what was going to happen to Jessica. I told him the system would decide, not me and not him. He asked if I still loved her, and I thought carefully before answering that she was my daughter, and I'd always love her. But love didn't mean ignoring what she did. It meant holding her accountable because accountability was the only path to real change. Daniel nodded slowly and said Grandpa would be proud of me. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo I'd found at Victor's house from 2010 with all of us together, Victor in the center with his arms around me and Daniel, Jessica beside me smiling at 18 years old. I said quietly that Victor was always proud of both of us even when we didn't deserve it. Daniel stared at the photo for a long moment and asked if we could ever be a family again. I answered honestly that not the way we were, but maybe in a different way, something built on truth instead of assumptions. He said he'd like that. We sat there for another hour talking about small things, his IT job at a healthcare company in Portland, his apartment, The Blazers' terrible season, normal things, and the kind of conversation we hadn't had in years. When we finally stood to leave, Daniel paused at the door and asked if I'd talked to Jessica since the trial. I shook my head, and when he asked if I was going to, part of me wanted to and needed to understand why, but another part knew some conversations don't bring healing and just reopen wounds. I said not yet, and Daniel nodded, saying he didn't think he could either for a long time. He hugged me again at his car, quick, awkward, but real, then drove away while I stood in the parking lot of the Pinewood Diner watching him go. I was alone again, but this time the loneliness felt different, less like abandonment and more like space to breathe. Systems don't hurry, but they don't forget. 2 weeks after the conservatorship hearing, Jessica Bennett was formally charged with 3 felony counts. Ellen called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was making coffee in my apartment. "The DA's office filed this morning," she said without preamble. 3 counts. Elder financial exploitation Class B felony. Forgery of legal documents Class B felony. Wire fraud federal charge. I set the coffee mug down carefully. "What's she looking at?" "If convicted on all counts, up to 20 years. I didn't say anything. "Michael, are you okay? What happens next?" Ellen explained the process. Arraignment within 2 days. Jessica would enter a plea, probably not guilty. Then discovery motions, and eventually either a plea deal or trial. "This isn't easy," Ellen said quietly. "I know she's your daughter." "What happens next?" I repeated. The investigation didn't just expand, it accelerated. Gloria Patterson, the woman who'd facilitated Jessica's transactions through Patterson Financial Services, was contacted by federal agents within days. She cooperated immediately. Ellen forwarded me the summary. Gloria had processed $162,000 in wire transfers from Victor's accounts over 14 months. Jessica had told her it was an early inheritance distribution. Gloria hadn't verified, hadn't asked for documentation, just processed the transactions and kept her fee 8 to 10% on each transfer, totaling approximately $14,580. She provided everything: emails from Jessica, transaction logs, dates and amounts. The banks confirmed it independently. Every transaction flagged. No legitimate purpose. No supporting documentation. Textbook financial diversion pattern. Adult Protective Services filed their formal report. Victor had been in a vulnerable state. Jessica had isolated him, controlled his communication with family. Classic financial abuse. By mid-November, the case was airtight. Kevin Marshall, the deputy DA handling the prosecution, called me directly. "Mr. Bennett, I wanted to update you personally. We have a very strong case. Your father's journal, the recordings, the financial records. Gloria Patterson's testimony, it's overwhelming." "Okay." Jessica's attorney has requested plea negotiations. "I wanted to make sure you're comfortable with that approach." I thought about that. What would a plea deal look like? Realistically, 18 to 24 months incarceration. 5 years supervised probation after release. Full restitution, $185,000 plus interest, so about $197,000 total. Permanent ban on serving in any fiduciary capacity, and a felony record. He paused. "If she doesn't accept, and we go to trial, if a jury convicts, she could face up to 10 years federal plus state charges running consecutively." "What do you need from me?" "Your opinion matters. This is your father's case." I looked out the window. Rain streaked the glass. "Do what's right, not what I want. Just what's right. And if a plea deal serves justice, then take it." Jessica rejected the first offer, then the second. Her new attorney, more expensive than Mark Sullivan, tried to argue diminished capacity. Stress, misunderstanding, good intentions gone wrong. But the evidence didn't support that narrative. The recordings showed calculation. The journal showed Victor's awareness. The financial timeline showed deliberate pattern. In mid-December, facing a trial date in January, Jessica's attorney called Kevin Marshall. She accepted the deal. The terms were straightforward. Count 1 elder exploitation. Guilty. 18 months incarceration. Count 2 forgery. Guilty. Sentenced to run concurrent. Count 3 wire fraud. Dismissed in exchange for guilty plea. Restitution $197,000 payable over probation period. Probation 5 years supervised following release. Fiduciary ban permanent prohibition on managing accounts for vulnerable individuals. Record permanent felony. Sentencing scheduled for January 2025. Ellen called to tell me it was done. She accepted. I closed my eyes. How did she look? Her attorney said she seemed resigned. Not remorseful, just resigned. That sounded like Jessica. She'd never been good at admitting she was wrong. The DA's office wants to know if you'd like to give a victim impact statement at sentencing. No. Michael, my father already spoke. Through his journal. That's enough. Ellen was quiet for a moment. Victor would be proud of how you handled this. I didn't handle it. The system did. You gave the system what it needed. That took courage. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee I'd forgotten to drink. December rain streaked the window. City lights blurred through the water, distorted and distant. I pulled out my phone and texted Daniel. Jessica accepted a plea deal, 18 months. Sentencing in January. His reply came a minute later. Are you going to the sentencing? I stared at the question for a long time. Number 1. I don't think it would help anyone. I understand. Are you okay? I will be. The sentencing would happen in January. The judge would accept the plea. Jessica would be remanded to custody, probably Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, Oregon's women's prison. 18 months. When she got out, she'd have 5 years of check-ins, drug tests, employment reporting. She'd have to find work with a felony on her record. Rebuild from nothing. I wouldn't be there for any of it. Not because I didn't care, but because some distances need time to cross. And Jessica and I weren't ready for that. Maybe we never would be. Victor's voice echoed in my memory, from the recording we'd played in court. I trust you to do what's right, son. I had done what was right. The system had done what was right. But right didn't erase the loss. It didn't bring my father back. It didn't restore the family we'd been. It just was. Outside, the rain continued. The city moved on. And I sat alone in my apartment, holding a cold cup of coffee, wondering if justice was supposed to feel this empty. The first time I woke up and realized the case was truly over, nothing felt different. No overwhelming relief. No sense of victory. Just silence. It was February. Rain continued as it always did in Oregon this time of year. But somewhere beneath the gray sky and cold mornings, I felt the faint promise of spring, not in the weather, but in the way the days were slowly getting longer. Small shifts. Incremental change. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. From HR Department, Sentinel Risk Analytics, subject formal apology and reinstatement offer. Dear Mr. Bennett, we are writing to apologize for placing you on administrative leave without fully understanding the circumstances surrounding the conservatorship filing. We have since learned the outcome of the legal proceedings and understand what truly occurred. We would like to invite you back to your position, with full back pay for the suspension period, compensation for any reputational damage, and a formal apology sent to any professional partners who were notified of your leave. I read it twice, then I typed my response. Thank you for the apology. I accept it. But I'm declining to return. I've found a different path. I hit send without hesitation. 2 days later, my bank accounts were unfrozen. The hold was lifted. My pension payments suspended during litigation resumed. Financial stability quietly returned. Not with fanfare. Just a series of automated notifications and balance updates. It felt strange. For months, I'd been locked out of my own life. And now the doors were opening again one by one. A neighbor I barely knew, Mrs. Cooper, from 3 units down, knocked on my door one afternoon. She was holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. Mr. Bennett, I owe you an apology. She was in her 60s, soft-spoken and clearly uncomfortable. I signed an affidavit for your daughter. Jessica told me you were struggling, that you needed help. I thought I was doing the right thing. She looked down. I didn't know the whole story. I should have talked to you directly. I took the casserole. Thank you for coming by. I'm so sorry. I know, it's okay. She wasn't the only one. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 others reached out. A former colleague, someone from my father's church, each expressing regret for believing Jessica's narrative without questioning it. I accepted every apology, not because I'd forgotten what it felt like to be isolated, to have people believe I was incompetent without asking me, but because holding grudges doesn't help anyone. And I didn't have the energy for bitterness anymore. Thomas Reed called in late February. How are you holding up? I'm getting there. Good. A pause. I've got something for you. Oregon Department of Human Services is looking for an elder abuse prevention consultant. Train APS staff, develop protocols, review complex cases. They need someone with investigative background and real-world experience. I didn't say anything. You'd be perfect for it, Michael. I don't know if I'm ready. Ready for what? To use what happened to help other people. His voice was firm. That's exactly when you're ready. He was right. I applied that afternoon. The interview was a week later. 3 people on the panel. Standard questions about experience, approach, case management. Then the director, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward. Why do you want this job? I could have given a professional answer. Skills, qualifications, career trajectory. Instead, I told the truth. I couldn't save my father. Despite the training, despite the experience, I didn't see what was happening until it was too late. I paused. I can't change that. But maybe I can help other families avoid what mine went through. She nodded slowly. That's the best answer anyone's ever given me for this position. They offered me the job the next day. I accepted. My first day was in early March. Spring was beginning to creep through Oregon's long rains. Not in full bloom yet, but in the way the air felt slightly warmer, the light a little brighter. I stood in front of a training room with 20 APS caseworkers and investigators. Young, dedicated, overwhelmed. I taught them the warning signs of financial exploitation, how to document evidence, how to build cases that would hold up in court, how to talk to vulnerable adults without making them feel accused or ashamed. After the session, a young woman, late 20s, eager, approached me. You really know this field. Have you worked a lot of these cases? I thought about Victor, about his journal, about the recordings I'd never forget. I have, she smiled. Thank you. This really helps. She left, and for the first time since my father's death, I felt something I hadn't expected. Purpose. That evening, Daniel called. Dad, how was your first day? Really good. I'm proud of you. Those words, simple, sincere, meant more than he could know. A pause. Then, Jessica's sentencing is next week. Are you going? I stopped. I'd told myself I wouldn't. That there was nothing to be gained from sitting in a courtroom watching my daughter be sentenced to prison. Are you going? I asked. Yeah, I think I need to be there. I thought about Daniel, 28 years old, walking into a courtroom to watch his sister face consequences. Alone. I'll go, I said. Not for her, for you. Dad, you don't have to. I do. You showed up for me when I needed it. Now it's my turn. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment. Outside, the city moved on as it always did. Lights flickering in distant windows. People living their lives unaware of mine. But I wasn't empty anymore. I wasn't just surviving. I was building something. Not the life I'd had before, but something different. Something that came from pain but wasn't defined by it. Because family isn't about who's in the room. It's about who shows up when things get hard. Daniel had shown up for me. Now it was my turn. The call from Ellen came on a Tuesday morning in March, informing me the plea hearing had concluded about an hour ago. I was standing in my apartment, looking out at the soft drizzle that made everything look gray. And Ellen explained Jessica received 18 months at Coffee Creek, with 5 years probation after that, plus a restitution order for $197,000 to be paid in structured installments. Judge Winters was clear this was a serious breach of fiduciary duty and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I'd known this was coming and had agreed to the plea terms when Kevin Marshall called last week, but hearing it now final and official felt different. After thanking Ellen, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, thinking about Jessica going to prison. The girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms and drew me a card every Father's Day until she turned 16. I thought I'd feel relief or maybe vindication, but instead I just felt tired. The letter took me 3 tries to get right. I sat at my kitchen table on a warm Saturday afternoon in June, with windows open and a breeze carrying the scent of cut grass and blooming lilacs, the kind of day my father would have spent in his garden. I wrote to Jessica that she was still my daughter, and some things needed to be said directly, not through lawyers or the court system. What she did to her grandfather was wrong, and the court had determined that with overwhelming evidence, but I wasn't writing to punish her further, because the system had already done that. I needed her to understand that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting or pretending it didn't happen, or that trust hadn't been broken. If she wanted to rebuild that trust, it would require acknowledgement of what she did without excuses. Restitution, not just financial, but relational, with time and effort and consistency and patience, because trust is rebuilt slowly, one honest conversation at a time. I wasn't closing the door, but I wasn't pretending it was wide open either. And she'd need to knock while I'd need to see who's on the other side. Daniel and I were here when she was ready to be honest. Her grandfather loved her, and I loved her, and that hadn't changed. But love didn't mean accepting harm or pretending accountability didn't matter. The next move was hers. I folded the letter carefully, mailed it to Coffee Creek Correctional Facility the next day, and didn't know if she'd ever read it, but I had to say it. The estate closed on June 12th, and I drove to the house on Cedar Street one last time. The for sale sign had a red sold rider across it, with freshly mowed lawn and trimmed hedges. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, walking slowly through empty rooms that echoed in a way full ones never do. The living room where my father had sat in his recliner every evening was bare, with just pale rectangles on the hardwood floor where furniture used to be. I walked through the kitchen, where we'd shared countless meals, and where Jessica had signed the power of attorney, while my father sat confused and afraid. Then through the master bedroom, where he'd spent his final months, and up to the attic where Daniel had found Victor's letter. I paused in the hallway, looking at the one thing I'd left behind for this final visit. A single photograph in a simple frame resting on the windowsill. My father in his classroom, circa 1985, standing at the chalkboard, chalk in hand mid-lesson. Equations covered the board behind him. He looked younger than sharper, alive with purpose. I picked it up, slid it into my jacket, locked the front door, handed the keys to the realtor waiting in her car, and drove away without looking back, because he would have wanted us to move forward. My first day at the Oregon Department of Human Services was June 15th, in an office on the 3rd floor of a state government building in downtown Portland. My cubicle had a window overlooking the Willamette River, and I put a photo of Daniel and my father from 2010 on my desk. By the end of my second week, I was training 20 APS caseworkers, teaching them that financial exploitation of the elderly often follows predictable patterns with sudden changes in account activity, unexplained withdrawals, new friends or helpers with access to finances and powers of attorney signed during periods of cognitive decline. When a young woman named Sarah asked how I knew where to start with my father's case, I paused and said I didn't at first. I just knew something was wrong and didn't stop until I found the truth. An older caseworker named George nodded and said my father would be proud. And I thought about that on the drive home, hoping it was true. Daniel called that evening saying he saw my name in a DHS press release and asked how it felt. I said it felt like I was finally using what I learned for something that matters. And when he said he was proud of me, I closed my eyes and thanked him. He asked if I'd heard from Jessica, and I said no. Then he admitted quietly he didn't know if he was ready to see her yet, but was glad I wrote. I told him to take his time because there was no rush, and he thanked me for not giving up on Grandpa or on him. I told him he was my son, and I'd never give up on him. On a Sunday afternoon in late June, I found myself driving south on Cedar Street one last time without planning it. The house looked different with new owners, a swing set in the backyard, flowers in planter boxes, and a dog barking inside. I pulled over with engine idling, thinking about everything my father had taught me, and how 22 years in the FB taught me that silence isn't weakness, but strategy, patience, and knowing when to act and when to trust that truth will surface on its own. Jessica had thought I'd given up and faded into irrelevance, but she didn't understand I was watching, documenting, building a case. My father had understood and left me the tools I needed, trusting me to use them at the right time. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. The road ahead was uncertain, and the work at DHS would be hard, with every case a reminder of what I couldn't save, and every family a chance to prevent what happened to mine. But for the first time in a long time, I was ready. Some doors close forever, some stay open waiting, and some you have to walk through not knowing what's on the other side. I chose to walk through, and whatever happens next, I know I made the right choice. The afternoon sun filtered through the green canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the pavement, and in the rearview mirror, Cedar Street grew smaller, then disappeared around a corner. I kept driving. If you've listened to my story from beginning to end, I need you to hear this. Family betrayal isn't just a phrase, it's a wound that changes everything you thought you knew about love and trust. When the person who hurts you shares your blood, shares your name, the pain doesn't just cut deep. It rewrites your understanding of who you are. I've worked grandpa stories my entire career, cases of elders exploited, robbed, left vulnerable by the very people who promised to protect them. I built training protocols around family betrayal. I taught investigators how to spot the warning signs. But when it happened in my own home, when my daughter became the predator and my father became the victim, all that expertise felt like nothing. God gives us family, but He also gives us the strength to face hard decisions when love is weaponized against the innocent. These grandpa stories aren't rare. They're everywhere. Right now, someone's grandmother is signing away her savings under pressure. Someone's grandfather is being isolated from anyone who might ask questions. Family betrayal is happening in quiet living rooms, while neighbors assume everything's fine because it's family business. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you're holding a journal your father left behind, because he knew he couldn't trust his own daughter. If something feels wrong, sudden financial changes, a relative who suddenly controls everything, an elder who seems afraid or confused, act. Ask hard questions. Demand answers. Because in moments like that, your silence doesn't protect the family. It protects the abuser. The hardest lesson I've learned: you can love someone and still hold them accountable. You can grieve what they became while refusing to ignore what they've done. Grandpa stories like mine shouldn't fill courtrooms and case files, but they do. And they'll keep happening until we stop pretending that blood relations equal trustworthiness. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own experiences or simply let me know this mattered. Please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps these important conversations reach the people who need them most. And if you know someone navigating elder care or family conflict, share this episode with them. Thank you for walking this difficult journey with me. I know it wasn't easy to hear, and I promise you it wasn't easy to live through. One more thing before you go. The stories you'll hear on this channel moving forward may include dramatized elements created with the intent to educate and raise awareness. If this approach doesn't align with what you're looking for, feel free to explore other content that suits you better. No judgment, just options. Protect your elders. Question when things don't add up. And remember, loving someone doesn't mean accepting harm. It means having the courage to demand better. Until we meet again.